Mr. Chairman. Mr. Herman, I enjoyed your testimony. I enjoyed all the testimony. I had a chance to read through some of yours before the hearing, and you do a pretty good job of presenting some of the numbers. I always find it a little bit helpful around here to actually dig down into the numbers. And when you look at your testimony, there's some statistics from the Federal Highway Administration that would suggest that $1 billion invested in the nation to highways supports about 28,000 jobs. You're absolutely correct. Your last comment about somewhere under $100 billion of the last stimulus program going to infrastructure. And I think the number for actual roads was closer to $48 or $50 billion. We take the number 50 because I don't have my calculator and I'm doing this the old-fashioned way up here. That if you assume that that is correct and that that $50 billion should have created $28,000 per billion spent, that's 1.4 million jobs that would have been created from just that part of the stimulus bill, just the part spent on roads. Clearly, that cannot be the case. The very largest number that I have seen anybody try and lay claim to from the stimulus is 3 million jobs. That's from the Obama administration, and that was jobs saved or created. So on the very best day, the very best argument I've seen is that the stimulus created 3 million jobs, yet the FHA would have us believe that 1.4 million of those came from roads, leaving 1.6 million jobs to have been created from the other $800 billion. That's 16 times larger than the amount of money we spent on roads, supposedly created only 1.6, and that's on the very best day. By the way, as you dig down into it a little bit and you look at the weaknesses of numbers, while the Federal Highway Administration says $1 billion in spending creates 28,000 jobs, the Alliance for American Manufacturing says it only creates 18,000 jobs, so almost 40% less. Clearly it didn't work. Clearly it didn't work. The definition of insanity to me is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different outcome. So as we sit here today and hear calls for new and expanded stimulus, why should we expect that the next time it would be any different than last time? So, Dr. DeRugy, I'll ask you this question. You mentioned Dr. Summers' line about if it's not done correctly, if it's not targeted, if it's not timely and not temporary, that it could actually be counterproductive. Is that what we saw here, and if so, why is that?
Well, so the Keynesian theory, at least as it goes, is like you need to inject money quickly into the economy, and then you will have this multiplier effect. And so and not only do you need to do it quickly and timely, but you also need to do it in a very targeted manner, which means the assumption is that you're going to be picking up people from the unemployment line and putting them back to work.
Is your experience, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but again, we're on a time limit. Is your experience that the Federal Government is able to do that on a $50 billion project?
No, and well, that's one of the things that happened with the stimulus bill is like rather than actually thinking of how to spend the money productively, they basically went through the common and already existing channels. But more importantly, when it comes to infrastructure and targeting the spending, I mean, people have to understand that the people who are unemployed right now, people who were usually before the recession building houses, are not the one who have the skill sets to go and start building bridges and roads. And so this idea that you're able to actually get people from the unemployment lines who were doing different type of construction and make them and train them and get them prepared to have the skills to actually build roads is completely a misconception of how the way is done. And the study by Gary Jones and Dan Rothschild showed that half of the jobs that were supposedly created or saved were actually jobs that were poached from other existing jobs, other companies, and that it is very likely that these other companies didn't hire behind because they actually use these poaching to shrink the size of their labor force as they were struggling. So it can't work.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Puentes, I heard both you and Mr. Herman talk about the relative small size of the first stimulus. It was only $50 billion, or I think the total infrastructure spending was about $100 billion if you add things like the electrical grid. And that there's a lot of folks, I take it you're one of them, claiming or calling for a larger stimulus next time. Have you ever seen, gentlemen, I'll put it to you, Mr. Puentes first, any academic studies whatsoever that suggest there's any economies of scale when it comes to infrastructure spending, that if $50 billion didn't work, if $50 billion didn't get us the 1.4 million jobs that it was supposed to, that $100 billion will? Have you ever seen any academic studies that show that?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the concept. I think that we're talking about something now that is very different from what we were talking about just 3 years ago. And this idea of using this money to capitalize an infrastructure bank gets back to this larger point about what we want, again, what we want the American economy to do, and how do we make those investments strategically, right, in projects that it's not, this is not just a general grant program. The idea is for the money not just to go out to the states and to hope that the money is spent in ways that are...
I'm going to cut you off because we're out of time. I'm trying to be respectful. I'll save my extra minute for another time. What you're really saying is that next time we're going to do it better than we did last time.
It has to be fundamentally different. I think the idea is to do it very differently.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.